Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar that's brought to you by the St. John Paul II National Shrine. My name is Ken Balbuena, and I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach at the Shrine. I will be serving as your host and moderator for today's webinar, and thank you for joining us on this fifth Sunday of Lent. Today we are featuring Andrew and Maureen Walther, the authors of the new book, The Knights of Columbus, An Illustrated History. They will be discussing their new book and sharing some of the work about the Knights, who just so happen to own and operate the St. John Paul II National Shrine. Now, Andrew has a background as an award-winning educator, journalist, international religious freedom advocate, and member of the senior staff of the Knights of Columbus in New Haven, Connecticut. He's a proud undergraduate and graduate alum of the University of Southern California, where he earned degrees in classics. He also did work in medieval history. He has served with the Knights of Columbus Supreme Office for the last decade and a half, helping to build and advance the Knights' media and public relations presence, as well as its social media channels. Andrew has also organized major conferences and events around the world that were co-sponsored by the Knights of Columbus and the Vatican. Andrew has helped lead the Knights' international religious freedom advocacy and humanitarian efforts on behalf of persecuted Christians in the Middle East. Maureen is a graduate of Princeton University, where she specialized in medieval Latin and Old English texts. She holds certificates in medieval studies and creative writing. She was born blocks away from the Knights' birthplace in New Haven, Connecticut, and has been a lifelong parishioner at St. Mary's, where Father McGivney served. Maureen is a researcher, writer, and editor with more than a decade of experience at the Knights of Columbus. She has worked on a wide range of historical projects and also served many years as a special assistant to the Supreme Knight. Maureen's work has also involved editing several books, including La Cristiada, The Mexican People's War for Religious Liberty, which was published in 2013. We will have a question and answer period at the end of this webinar, so please be sure to type your questions in the Q&A box below. We will do our best to get through as many of them as possible. And we are pleased to have Andrew and Maureen with us today, so let's get started. Andrew and Maureen, welcome.
Hi, good to be here.
Hello.
All right, so super fantastic to have everyone here. So let's begin with Andrew. Now today is known as Founders Day with the Knights of Columbus because it's when the state of Connecticut officially incorporated the Knights as a legal entity on March 29th, 1882. Can you please tell our audience a little bit more about Father McGivney and why he started the Knights?
Sure. Well, Father McGivney grew up in Connecticut in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, and he had, in his experience, a wide range of things that really led him to ultimately found the Knights. For one thing, he had experienced the way that Catholics were sometimes dismissed in greater society. He was alive when the New York Times opined about the church that he ended up being a parish priest at, St. Mary's, and talked about it being a blight on an aristocratic avenue. He had himself lost his father. He had worked in a brass factory in Waterbury. He had had a lot of very interesting experiences in his education, had been in seminary in Canada and the United States, was very well educated, was a very good student. And as he came to work with people in Connecticut and New Haven in particular, he started to see the need for an organization that could bring Catholic men together for charitable purposes, for faith purposes, and to provide, in the case of the death of a widow in the case of the death of a breadwinner, to provide for widows and orphans. And basically, Father McGivney's prime concern, if you read the eulogies on him, if you read the contemporary accounts, very much interested in protecting the faith of his flock and very much interested in protecting their families, both financially and also in terms of their faith. Because of course, if a breadwinner died, the family would get split up, and often they would end up in a non-Catholic or even anti-Catholic environment in a state institution with relatives. And so Father McGivney, who himself had posted bonds for Catholic young people so that this wouldn't happen to them, understood that there needed to be some sort of system here and something to compete with the anti-Catholic societies that offered this kind of life insurance and were drawing Catholic men away with those financial inducements.
Yeah, that was very kind of a dangerous time for particularly working Catholics at the time. And Father McGivney, he ended up dying pretty young at his own age, right?
Yeah, and in fact, just to become a priest was to enter a vocation that had a very short lifespan. On average, the priest would live until 40 years old. For him, it was even shorter. The archdiocese at the time had a very fast turnover of priests. So even though there were a lot of priests and young men were entering seminary young, they had a priest shortage very, very similar to today. So
Yeah, we can see up there. There's a little card from his funeral mass here. He was only 38 years old.
yeah.
Yeah, he was. And I'll read you something briefly that I brought along, which is a eulogy on Father McGivney from 1900 from a priest named Father O'Donnell, who knew him very well. And I'll just read a little bit of it. But he says, "Well shall it be with the Knights of Columbus as an order if its individual members possess the spirit that dominated its founder. Genial, approachable, kindly disposition, cheerful under reverses, profoundly sympathetic with those whom had fallen the heavy hand of affliction." And it goes on and on. The poor found in him a good Samaritan. The years spent by Father McGivney in the sacred ministry were replete with deeds that honor his name and no doubt are now the brightest jewels in the crown he has received from the just judge. So there was a real respect for him.
Yeah, and so while his fame definitely comes from him founding the Knights, at the time he was equally well known amongst his parishioners and people who knew him for his holiness, his good character, his piety, his sense of humor. So one of the interesting things about working on this project was to kind of go back in time and start to see him through the eyes of the people who knew him.
Yeah, definitely was a very humble person. Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to be able to be up in New Haven, Connecticut at the Knights of Columbus Museum twice. And in fact, you have a slide in here on page 197 that shows the McGivney Gallery at the Knights of Columbus Museum. And while it's a little difficult to see from this particular picture, one of my favorite pieces that he wore was his cassock. Now he was buried in his cassock. It wasn't like a special one that he wore that they put him in just for his funeral, but this was like the everyday cassock that he wore. And in fact, I heard when they exhumed his body to move him from Waterbury to New Haven, they found his cassock had like these stitch marks in it that he hand stitched himself, and that was one that he wore every single day, just showing his simplicity and humility.
Yeah, he was known for that. I mean, he was known as a very down to earth priest, and he turned down the office of Supreme Knight. He was invited to be Supreme Knight by the men, and he said no. He wanted this to be a lay run organization, and became Supreme Secretary for a time, and then Supreme Chaplain, and really wanted to have spiritual influence, but had very clearly in his mind that the men had to run the organization, the laymen had to run.
Excellent. Well, let's shift gears a little bit. So the Knights of Columbus really have been a driving force behind a lot of charitable work that many may not be aware of, including a lot of humanitarian work during World War I and fighting for human rights. They've particularly been a visual presence during the March for Life, and have fought hard to protect religious liberty in the Middle East. Now, as everyone is well aware now, we've had a different kind of challenge over the last month or so, and that's the COVID-19 epidemic that we have. Can you tell me a little bit about what the Knights are doing to respond to this?
Well, sure. The Knights are doing a couple of things, and more will be forthcoming in the next couple of days, so I don't want to get too far over my skis here. But one thing the Knights have done is, just last week we announced that we're allowing or putting out a $100 million fund to provide low interest lines of credit to dioceses all over the country to help them weather the storm. We've also invited our men to pray, a novena in particular, based on the words of Pope Francis, as well as the prayer that the USCCB put out to Our Lady of Guadalupe. And we've also asked our members to donate blood, assuming that they're under 60 in good health and not feeling any symptoms of illness or living with someone in those categories. So we've asked our guys to get involved, and you'll see even more of this in the next couple of days as we really ramp up in this new environment to help with the shifting needs that communities have. And that's been the hallmark of the Knights. In World War I, Catholic troops needed chaplains. The Knights provided chaplains, but we also provided goods and services, let's say, which means, you know, the letters home, coffee, donuts, a warm place to take a nap or a hot shower, a clubhouse, sporting facilities, to the troops in World War I before there was a USO. Everybody welcome, everything free. The only place in the entire military that didn't draw the color line, that had access also for African Americans. So we were, you know, we've adapted to these needs in World War II as well, in the Depression, helping with job placement, helping with veterans in innumerable ways. And now in the current crisis, it's the same thing, finding creative ways to adapt in a faith-filled setting is really the history of the Knights of Columbus.
And here's a good photo of one of those things you were talking about, the everyone welcome, everyone free, everything free. So this is a World War I photo that we have here. So yeah, so that's fantastic. A lot of the great things that we've got going on, you know, particularly, you know, we're kind of homebound, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do a webinar kind of like this, to be able to bring, you know, content for people who are at home and cannot get out and maybe come to the shrine like they normally would, or come over to the Knights of Columbus Museum, or just get out and about and even go to their own parish, you know, particularly here, you know, during this fifth Sunday of Lent. All right, now, of course, I just want to remind all of our people out in our virtual audience that there is a question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions for Andrew and Maureen that you would like to ask, please do so in the question and answer box down below, and we'll get to them, get to answer as many of them as possible that we can. Now, of course, I would be a little bit remiss, given that I work at the St. John Paul II National Shrine, if I did not bring up the relationship between the Knights and the shrine there. So the shrine is not only my place of work, but it's a very special place in my heart because of my own connections with St. John Paul II, as well as Father McGivney. In fact, I talked quite a bit about it during my own interview in the Arlington Catholic Herald, which is a local diocesan newspaper across the river from me. But can you tell me why the shrine was such an important pastoral initiative of the Knights, and how do you see John Paul II's legacy being carried out there?
Well, you know, the Knights of Columbus had a really incredible relationship with St. John Paul II. We've had very, very strong relationships with the papacy going back to Benedict XV in 1920. But with St. John Paul II, the world was changing in a number of very interesting ways that intersected in terms of his priorities and those of the Knights of Columbus. When I was at the canonization of St. John Paul II, Pope Francis referred to him as the Pope of the family. And of course, from Father McGivney forward, a very strong emphasis of the Knights of Columbus has been the family, has been the Catholic family in particular. Pope John Paul II had a very strong focus on evangelization and the new evangelization. Father McGivney, when you read what he wrote, and also when you read what people say about him, very interested in evangelizing the men and the families of his time. And third is the fact that the Knights of Columbus have a really long history going back to the 19th century of standing up for religious freedom, for the rights of Catholics, for the rights of others that are being persecuted. And this was also a priority for St. John Paul II that brought him and the Knights of Columbus into some really unique collaborations, with the filming of his trip to Mexico, the smuggling of those tapes into Poland so that the Polish people would have a better understanding of how they might react when the Pope got there, of the conference we did in Rome on the Common Christian Roots of Europe, the publication of that book, which again was taken behind the Iron Curtain to really push back against the totalitarian ideology there. Our support of Cardinal Mindszenty before this had been, you know, part of the longstanding tradition that we had in terms of standing up for religious freedom in the Soviet bloc. But working so closely with John Paul II, I think it was natural to want to continue the legacy, the profound legacy that he had in terms of these issues. He was obviously an enormous character in terms of theological contributions, historical contributions, and I think it's a fitting tribute to him that we created this monument and this shrine in his honor, which continues to draw people to him in terms of faith, in terms of an understanding of history, in terms of an understanding of his theology, especially as it relates to the family. I think all of those things are incredibly important. And it's not the first thing the Knights of Columbus have done in terms of evangelization. And Maureen can tell you chapter and verse on the things that we've done previous to this, which I think would be very interesting for people to understand where this came from.
Well, yeah, even early on, men who joined the Knights remarked about themselves and about other people that the Knights strengthened their faith, brought them back to the faith. Early on, there was also concern about men who weren't doing that. So this was on the mind of the early Knights. And then you have in the 40s and the 50s and onward, the Knights of Columbus taking up evangelization and apologetics explicitly through what's now known as Catholic Information Service. So there was a very explicit evangelization component to that. So it was, in a sense, what you have now at the shrine is magnificent and new, but it's still part of the continuum.
Yeah, definitely. Now, if I can show off on the shrine just a little bit, you can see here, this is our Redemptor Omnis Church, and inside we have, it really takes Redemptor Omnis, the first encyclical of St. John Paul II, and really enlivens it through mosaic artwork that was done by Father Marco Rupnik, whose artwork is seen all over the world and was a personal friend of St. John Paul II. So just if I can show off a little bit here, you can see a lot of the mosaics that we have here. We just celebrated the Feast of the Annunciation recently, so you see that there's a lot of different things that talk about how the salvation of man came about, which is what Redemptor Hominis is all about. So you can see a lot of the great mosaics that are here that are floor to ceiling. Some people may wonder why St. John Paul II is present. He had a very close connection with Mary and wanted us to obviously follow her example. But we also have inside our Luminous Mysteries Chapel that have more floor-to-ceiling mosaics that talk about the mysteries of light, JP2, instituted in 2002. Also have a first-class relic of St. John Paul II that's present there. And then on our lower level, of course, we have some great artifacts in our world-class exhibit there, the life of St. John Paul II, that have great stunning videos, interactive panels where you can talk, you can see all those different trips that you had talked about, Maureen. As well as some things here of his other teachings like World Youth Days. So it's a fantastic place. If you have not been able to visit it, I highly encourage that you do. But I want to shift a little bit, if you don't mind, to about talking a little bit more about your book in particular. So can you tell me a little bit about, it is quite stunning, I should say, but some great photos that normally aren't seen outside of Columbia Magazine or the Knights of Columbus Museum or the archives. But can you tell me a little bit about the process of writing the book and why it was important for you to be able to tell the story of the Knights of Columbus in this way?
Well, it really got started in 2007. And in 2007, we had our 125th anniversary, which was obviously a very big deal for the Knights of Columbus. And in the course of that year, we had a new photo archivist who was really good and was finding and bringing to light all of these incredible photographs. And in talking about the things that we were finding in the archives with the Supreme Knight, Mr. Anderson said, it would be great to put some of these in a book and to let our guys see this history. And we talked a minute ago about the incredible relationship we've had with the papacy going back to Benedict XV, and just being in Rome, 4 weeks ago with Pope Francis, and the things that he's said that echo what we were just talking about with St. John Paul II in terms of, being good examples of fatherhood, being good examples of men. He's encouraged us in our pro-life work and our work with marriage and family and our witness. And I think when you look at that and you say, all of this, there's this great continuum within the Knights of Columbus, that the faith aspect, the charity aspect, the standing up for people's rights aspects, all of these things have been a long time in coming, but it's very different when you can actually look behind the curtain and get a window into the 19th century that you don't normally get, except maybe in a Hollywood movie, or maybe if you go to a particular museum. But most people don't wake up in the morning and immerse themselves in the 19th century or the early 20th century or the mid 20th century. And this book allows people to look behind the curtain a little bit. And Maureen can tell you even more about that, because she did a lot of the technological research and the doors that were opened there.
Well, what was really fascinating about this project was not only is it the first history of the entire order in a number of decades, but it's really the first to come about since the internet has come of age, since the digitization of the archives at the Knights of Columbus. Yeah, even when I first was working at the Knights, you would go into the archives and it was just a fraction of what was available. It would just be stacks and stacks of boxes that had been closed for way too long. So it was really lovely to be able to bring these to light. And one of the hardest things I would say about working on this book was literally for every photo that is in the book, there were like 10 or 15 that had to be rejected. So, which is kind of a problem that every researcher and writer wants.
Yeah.
But so it was great to be able to really go into, and it wasn't just the Knights of Columbus archives that were digitized, but it was archives all around the country and around the world that made it possible to really find stuff about the Knights, especially on the local level. A lot of the histories in the past about the Knights has been pretty exclusively about what the Knights of Columbus have done on kind of a Supreme Council level. But it was really nice to be able to find out what, you know, councils in Kansas were doing, or Tennessee, or Oregon, or all these different places, you know, even into the Mexico, to really bring to light that hard work that's done every day on the local level by the local councils. It was really, really an honor to work with.
Yeah. And so we see the cover of the book here. So where can people go to buy this book, by the way?
Well, it's in the usual places, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I think there's a bookstore in Tennessee that has a bunch of them, Unison Books. So you can find it online, certainly. Amazon at the moment is having some shipping problems related to all of the food and other essentials that they're shipping. But in general, it's available. And when bookstores reopen, when the COVID crisis is over, it'll be in your local bookstore too.
Yeah. Now, in the meantime, while we are kind of at home and we're, you know, confined to the house here, or at least should be confined to the house, how can someone, you know, maybe join the Knights? You know, I've been a Knight myself for about 5 years in 4th degree, but for those Catholic men out there, or for wives who wish to encourage their husbands to join the Knights, how can they join, and what can they be expected from membership?
Well, people can join online at the KFC website, kfc.org. One of the first options you have on that website is to be able to join the Knights. And right now, as I said, the Knights are being very creative in the ways that we're responding to the COVID crisis. But what a man can expect in joining the Knights is really solid faith formation. You see this with programs like Into the Breach, the video series we launched just this month. You see it with programs like the Domestic Church, which is about as timely as you can imagine, given people being at home. You see it in so many ways, the emphasis on the rosary, the emphasis on the Eucharist, the emphasis on prayer in general. So people can certainly expect a solid faith formation, and they can also expect to put their faith into action, right? Faith in action is something we talk about a lot. This was something that Father McGivney understood well, because there was the faith piece, but there was also the charity piece. And those two pieces working together, and they're really, the charity is based on the great commandment: love God with your entire heart completely, love your neighbor as yourself. And the second flows from the first. So I think if a man is looking to learn more about the faith, to get more involved in the faith, to deepen his faith, and to live it out concretely, then the Knights of Columbus is a great place to go, and kfc.org is the place to start. And I think the wives' perspective is also very important here, because obviously, what's their husband up to?
Well, it was really interesting. I was at one of the conventions one year, and I overheard a woman say, "Oh, we're just here as arm candy." And it broke my heart, because I was right in the middle of this project. And the Knights of Columbus would not exist, for one thing, the women who inspired the men to love them. And they inspired them to love them with a love that went beyond the grave, quite literally. And that was one of the great inspirations for these men to join with Father McGivney. And about the crisis today, I hear a lot of people talking about using this time, you know, this is a great test in history, for a number of generations. It's like the first great test. And they want to come out on the other side of this very brave and better people. And I see joining the Knights of Columbus as one of those few things that somebody can do now, which will provide a seamless continuity through the crisis and afterwards.
And I would add one thing. The number of guys that I know that are knights who told me, I'm a knight because my wife told me, you've got to be one of those guys. I mean, this is at least, more than half of the stories that I've been told are the woman in the house says, I really think this is a good organization for you because I like what they're doing on the faith side. I like what they're doing on the charity side. And so we talk about the Knights being a family organization. And certainly this has been increasingly the case in the last several decades, the last 4 decades in any event, that there's been a real emphasis on bringing the family together in so many ways, both in terms of activities and also events and conventions. Really having the family together is what the Knights of Columbus is all about.
So then it shouldn't come as any surprise to you if I say that my wife actually was the one that got me to join the Knights then.
You're in that more than 60% bracket I was talking about.
Yeah, we were at a pancake breakfast and my daughters were there. It was a breakfast with Santa because my council, 6153 in Springfield, Virginia, just happens to have a little bit of pool with Santa where he comes to our council every December. And, Santa loves us, but, he got me to just join the Knights, and my wife got me to join the Knights, and it's been a wonderful experience, and I love all the charitable work that we do. I'm so honored and blessed to be part of this organization. But believe it or not, we've almost gotten up to the full half hour here, but we haven't answered any questions, so I want to make sure that we get to a couple of them. So if you don't mind, we'll do a little rapid fire round here and just kind of go through all the questions as quickly as we can, and I'll try and stay in the order that they were asked. So how can we donate to best support the Knights of Columbus efforts for the COVID-19?
So the Knights of Columbus website, kfc.org, has a mechanism there where you can donate. And obviously, as we're leaning forward into helping in so many ways here, we have a disaster relief fund, which we've used for many previous disasters for things like hurricanes, Katrina, Sandy, Harvey, etc. And people can donate to KFC charities. So kfc.org. You'll find the donate button very prominent, and we're always happy to have people help us. And our response to these kinds of things goes back to previous pandemics in the 1890s, 1918, the San Francisco earthquake and fire in 1906. So we're old hands at helping out.
Fantastic. And while you're at KFC Charities, you can also go and donate to the Shrine as well. So help support us that way, or visit jp2shrine.org and do support the Shrine. There's a donate button right on our site. I got a couple questions about your book, not surprisingly. First of all, is your book available in electronic format?
Not yet. We're actually talking to the publisher about maybe doing a Kindle version. The problem is because of all the photographs, if it were available electronically, it would probably be best just to have the text. For the photos, it's hard to beat the hard copy.
Gotcha. So what was your favorite part about writing the book?
The research. Again, it's a researcher's dream because it was literally any element of history. I could just say, oh, I'm curious, and pull a thread and find out. And a perfect example, which ends up being timely, was the Spanish Flu Epidemic of 1918. That's represented in the book because I was thinking of what was happening around that time, and I was curious, what did the Knights do about it? I knew they were doing the army huts. What did they do? So I started researching it and found all kinds of heroic stories about the Knights of Columbus volunteers who were volunteering in the wards to bring comfort and consolation to the men who were opening up their halls on the military bases as hospitals and things. So it was just kind of a very rich and rewarding.
And there were so many little stories that just hadn't been known for so long. We found so many people that were knights that we didn't know. One of the founding fathers of the modern state of South Korea was a knight. You know, who knew? And yet he was really prominent, and we started in South Korea a few years ago. And here, one of their founding fathers, maybe their founding father, is a Knight of Columbus from the 1950s. And so you start finding these intersections with faith, with history, and it's just amazing how many things the Knights has touched over 138 years.
Yeah, and so I know online we have a section that's called Everyday Heroes that the Knights produce, but in the book you have notable Knights, and there's a ton of them that are spread all throughout the book. So I think you did a great job of highlighting as many of those as possible. And we got one person that just commented that they ordered the book through Amazon, shows a delivery date of April 1st. So I mean, that's coming up pretty quickly. You can order it and it gets right to your door. Look how Amazon responds to you. So you got two other questions here that are both kind of related to about the research. And one of them says, what is one thing that you discovered during your research that most amazed you? And the other one sort of related to that. What maybe was the biggest surprise that you discovered about Father McGivney?
Well, let's answer them together because in a way they could be related. Yeah. Father McGivney was really clever about who he brought together to form the Knights of Columbus. Father McGivney went out and got the leading Catholic men of New Haven. And when I say leading, he went out and got the guy who becomes the first immigrant mayor of New Haven. Now, mind you, we're living in an anti-Catholic, predominantly Protestant New England in the 19th century. Connecticut is only a few decades past having a know-nothing governor who really didn't like Catholics. And Father McGivney is getting these guys that know how to win civic elections in a Protestant town. Mm-hmm. Now, Protestant Catholic dynamics have changed a lot, but back then, that was really saying something. And so Father McGivney is choosing this guy. He's choosing another guy who's on the board of aldermen who becomes the first Supreme Knight. He's got the town coroner. He's got the town constable. He has all of these movers and shakers coming together to create an organization. In other words, he's picking men who could lead men. Yes. And he really was going after men with leadership ability very early on. And you see this continuing in the Knights of Columbus over the years. But in the mid 1890s, your Supreme Knight is also Secretary of State of Connecticut
at the same time.
At the same time, right? So I mean, this trend of having real solid leadership. And I think you've seen that over the course of the Knights of Columbus right up until now. You've seen incredibly good leadership, incredibly gifted and talented leadership, and men who could lead other men. And I think that was a singular insight of Father McGivney and a great contribution.
All right, so I know this is a brand new book, but there is a question: is there going to be a second book written?
Well, there's enough material. I feel like the end of the Gospel of St. John. There's a lot here.
There's more.
Yep. All right. One final question that we've got here, and then we do have to go because we're over time here. But what, if anything, from your research was left out of the book?
Again, there's enough material for another book. There's just no shortage. The Knights of Columbus in 14 decades have done an incredible amount. And I think what you see here is maybe more than the tip of the iceberg. It's certainly a really good introduction, highlight reel, way into the story. But for every story here, there are 10 more that could be here. And so I think what was left out of the book was
a lot.
Everything else. Everything that's not in the book was left out of the book.
Gotcha. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. So I do want to thank both of you for joining us here today. So before we go, I just want to make sure that I do a quick little plug for all of our virtual audience out there, that if you are interested in what you saw today and you want to see some future content from the St. John Paul II National Shrine, be sure to follow us on social media. It's JP2 shrine.org, or you can follow us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and also on Snapchat. So thank you again, Andrew and Maureen Walther, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. We hope you've enjoyed this webinar brought to you by the St. John Paul II National Shrine. And while the shrine is currently closed because of the coronavirus impact, we are planning several future online events to help bring the shrine to you. Please be sure to visit our website and follow us on social media about upcoming virtual events to view exclusive content or stream Mass online, as well as prayer at the hour of mercy. So thank you again for joining us. God bless, stay safe, and be well.